Hi, welcome to another batch of classic bookmarks. A couple of years ago, we realized that we had been producing Bookmark for 30 years, some 425 episodes. To celebrate, we chose 15 shows to enhance and broadcast. The reception has been terrific. Viewers got a real kick out of seeing or re-seeing the conversations with Toni Morrison, Ray Bradbury, William Styron, Alexander McCall Smith, and many others. So, we have chosen another 15 shows from the archives. Interviews with George Saunders, Margaret Atwood, E.O. Wilson, Walter Mosley, Albert Murray, James Haskins, and 9 others. Of course, we are continuing to produce new shows with new writers and old writer friends. But in the meantime, we hope you enjoy watching these classics as much as we enjoyed making them. Taylor Branch has brought his 20-year history project to a close. At Canaan's Edge, the third and final volume of America in the King Years covers the civil rights movement from the Selma to Montgomery March to the assassination in Memphis. This work is emotionally moving and intellectually complete. I spoke with Mr. Branch at the State Department of Archives and History in Montgomery. Mr. Branch, this is an honor. Thank you for coming in. I know you're having a very busy day.
Thank you, Don. It's great to be here.
And Alabama, of course, is a place that you are writing about, especially in volumes 2 and 3, a lot.
Absolutely. And of course, even doing the research, it's kind of like coming home because my mom was born in Birmingham.
Oh, well, what prepared you for this huge job of work that you've been doing for the last 2 decades? Where are you from? Where did you go to school?
I was born in Atlanta. I grew up in Atlanta. My father was in the dry cleaning business. I worked there from the age of 6. I went to college in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and graduate school at Princeton. But what really prepared me for this was that the civil rights movement was my formative education. It was in my formative years. I wasn't brought up to be interested in it, but it captured my attention against my will, really. I was 9 years old at the time of the bus boycott and 13 at the time of the sit-ins, 14 at the freedom rides, 16 in the Birmingham demonstrations, which were what really stupefied me, watching the little girls and walk into dogs and fire hoses. I was 18 at Selma and 21 when Dr. King was killed. So as a white Southerner who lived in Dr. King's town but never met him, I was nevertheless mesmerized by the power of this movement.
So you never did come face to face with the Reverend King?
I never met him. My mom went to his funeral. I was with my mother when he was killed, and a hush went through. By that time, I was very interested in the movement. I always knew it was the beginning of my interest in civil rights. Where did this come from? Where did this power come from? And basically, 20 years later, I started this writing project to try to answer the question of what had shaped my own life's interest.
What prompted you to open it up and go at this same material from that point of view?
Because it really seemed to me, just instinctively, having grown up through that period, that this period defined freedom and refined freedom for all of America. And therefore, the civil rights movement in this period was central to the only story America has. What does freedom mean? You know, we're founded on the idea, and that the movement was the driving force for that and captured all of American history, so that the presidents and even the bridge columnists are obsessed with race and freedom by the time that it ended. And that King was at the center of the movement, although not always at its head. He was in the middle, and people were focused on him, whether they were trying to kill him or surveil him or wiretap him or bug him or inspire him or get him to change direction. So he's right at the center of that. So I called it America in the King Years.
Yeah. But structurally, what you've done in this volume, more than in the earlier 2, is in a sense alternate between wherever Martin Luther King is and the Oval Office.
Kennedy, like white Southerners, was frightened by the civil rights movement and basically tried to keep it at arm's length. Johnson embraced it, although a lot of people didn't know that at the time. He embraced its purpose and he embraced the subtlety of all of its politics. And the conversations that you can now hear of Johnson talking to King about what an amazing historical event it was that King at Selma gave Johnson political room by creating a citizens movement to demand what Johnson wanted to do anyway, saying, I wouldn't have been able to do that if it hadn't been for you, is very, very rare in history. But your point about how this continues as bipolar is mostly because you have parallel struggles here in Selma over the most fundamental aspect of democracy, the right to vote, and Vietnam over can we foster democracy by force of arms. Of course, there are hardly any more contemporary urgent questions. We're trying to foster democracy in Iraq today. So this really does make it a struggle. This is why the 60s are such an incandescent period in history, because it's about the basic meaning of freedom.
Three of the major events in your books, because of the 50s and 60s, are the Montgomery bus boycott, the Birmingham Children's Crusade especially, right, and then Selma. And here's the question, if you like it as a question. Bull Connor and his violence on television played right into the hands of the movement.
Right.
It couldn't have looked any worse. It was universally understood to be pragmatically stupid. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Selma March, and it looked as if the people who were resisting the movement hadn't learned anything.
Right.
What do you make of that?
Well, I think that it's a great paradox. I think it's amazing that all three of these events happened here in Alabama, which to me makes it, I agree that it's a cradle of freedom because of this. But it raises, the fact that violence against the movement advanced the movement and melted people's resistance and distance from it and their consciences, not only around the country, but around the world, made them international events, should be something for all thinking people to really ponder, because what it says is that lasting power goes against the grain of violence, not with violence. And that should be a sobering thought to us if we're trying to create lasting power with violence. Because part of all of us thinks that violence and pulling out the gun is the resort to ultimate strength. But this history says that it's not the result of ultimate strength, that the movement, by showing the superhuman self-government, which is what we see as the key to American democracy, absorbed violence and turned that into lasting strength, which is why we now have votes in Alabama instead of violence, and we don't have really terrorism in Alabama, and that's what gives larger resonance to the freedom story that took place here in Alabama.
We are on television, so we're for television. Mm-hmm. we think television is neat. This is not something that you handle explicitly, mm-hmm, but the Vietnam War, it's often spoken of as the first televised war,
right,
and therefore a war people could understand and be horrified by.
Right.
Media played a huge role in Birmingham, not
right,
so much in Montgomery, but definitely the images of Birmingham and then the television images of Selma.
Absolutely.
Could it have been done without it?
It would have been much harder. It certainly concentrated it and made it much quicker. It had an effect on me. I'm 16 years old over in Atlanta, and I see these pictures of children marching into dogs and fire hoses, and it was an awakening moment. How can this be? I was just stupefied by it, yeah, because a lot of it was small girls. And by that time, I'm 16, and I had absorbed a lot of the movement, and I was telling myself, when I get really secure, the race issue is very frightening, but it's clear that there's some principles involved. Maybe we can make progress here. And when I get impossibly old and have some money, like 30 years old, maybe I'll stick my toe in it, and I turn around on TV and hear 8-year-old girls not waiting till they're 30 and marching right through those fire hoses. It's really remarkable. But it shows that the people who were absorbing violence are the ones that history vindicated. And that kind of discipline should give us pause and make us think about what the nature of power is.
Maybe a reasonable place to go next then is the sad, and you can use this word about once a month maybe, tragic issue of Black Power and Stokely Carmichael and the Panthers and SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the huge pressure that that put on Dr. King.
Again, through the media. A lot through the... Stokely is probably the third most important character in this last 3 years, which is a big surprise, or it was to me, because this book is... Lowndes County is like the hidden through line of this. It's the county between Selma and Montgomery that went through the wilderness county where a lot of the murders took place and the martyrs. There had never been a registered voter, a black registered voter in the 20th century in Lowndes County. And Stokely, after already having a breakdown, a mental breakdown from the stress of being nonviolent for 5 years, went into Lowndes County right after the march, alone, risked his life every day. And his work in Lowndes County, which is, by the way, where the Black Panther Party was founded, but it was a party of sharecroppers, mostly women in print dresses, risking their lives to vote for the first time. And this whole amazing effort where people are killed, and Stokely's absorbing this, was scorned. And I don't have many editorial comments, but the New York Times called their effort sabotage against democracy in an editorial, because they wanted Stokely's people to vote in the Democratic primary, and they're voting outside it. They had their little party symbol, which they traced from Clark College football mascot of a panther, because cats chase chickens. That was their reason. That became the origin of the Black Panther Party, but only because Stokely felt maligned, unappreciated, attacked. They said he was a subversive against democracy because they didn't understand what he was doing. And that was kind of the last straw for him. And within a few weeks, he renounces nonviolence, the vote, and democracy all at once, proclaims Black Power, and says that all these ideals he's been struggling for are tricks against black people. And to me, if we're going to examine the faults of that philosophy, we really need to understand the 5 or 6 years that went in of what I call historical service to American patriotism that went before. Most people in the anti-war movement, when I was around, said that they wanted to be nonviolent, but they lasted maybe about 5 minutes, if anything untoward happened. Stokely lasted 6 years.
The function of Chicago in the development of things. The movement to Chicago, King moving into the rundown apartment.
There are two interesting things about Chicago. First of all, its purpose was to show that America needed to grow up and stop thinking of the race issue as a sectional Southern issue.
Yeah.
Because anybody in the movement knew that it had never been that, but the country had, to a surprising degree now, looking back on it, settled into the notion that once the Southern segregation laws were repealed, there would be no race problem. King wanted to know better and show that there was a race problem in the North. He wanted to show that nonviolence could function in the North. He succeeded spectacularly in that because the marches that they had maintaining discipline were subjected to terrible violence in the white suburbs of Chicago. The other thing that's significant about it, it was the only movement that he ever had in his whole career, from the bus boycott until he was killed, that he did not frame as an appeal to all of the American people to deal with the issue of slums in the North. And the reason he did not do that is because he already knew in the sub-rosa politics that are so amazing to trace on the wiretaps and the telephone calls that Mayor Daley of Chicago had cut off his lines of appeal to Lyndon Johnson on both Vietnam War and on Northern segregation, that Johnson was so exposed just trying to do what he was doing in the South and in the war that it would be futile to try to do what King always did every other time. You know, this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, and appeal to the nation to answer these questions through the federal government. He framed Chicago as a local issue. And in many respects, he achieved a local settlement as good as strong as he did in Birmingham.
J. Edgar Hoover, the New York Times review of Volume 3 suggests that J. Edgar Hoover was either crazy or evil. Well, which was it? or whatever. What I'm asking is, finally, after listening to what must have been hundreds of hours, or reading transcripts of hundreds of hours of wiretaps, Freedom of Information Act, I presume, and so on.
In the basement of the FBI, in a windowless room. If you're willing to do that, you can read all you want. Ironically, these transcripts show King's inner circle arguing over every step of the way. They're always at one another's throats, but out of their own mouths they refute what J. Edgar Hoover had as the premise, which is that they're subversive. These are remarkably noble, idealistic conversations about how you create democracy, and they're even generous to the FBI. They're saying J. Edgar Hoover hates Dr. King, but his agents, for the first time, are really working to solve race crimes in the South, the terrorist crimes, because most agents don't go into the FBI wanting to sit there listening earphones on wiretaps, or do political things, or skulk around doing what they did against Dr. King, which was mostly nasty propaganda and harassments, and not telling him when he was the only person. There was an explicit order from J. Edgar Hoover: do not warn Martin Luther King about assassination attempts that we hear about. So it was pretty nasty. But I had people in the movement confront me and say, when I'm talking about Hoover, Diane Nash, to whom this book is dedicated, Selma was her idea as a young woman. I was complaining about Hoover, and she says, "Oh, Hoover's our fault." I said,
"Why is that?"
"Your fault." And I said, "Yes, we left him in a position of arbitrary secret power for 50 years. And all you have to do, you don't even have to read the Constitution or even more than one day of the debates about the Constitution to know that America's founded on the notion that unchecked power without checks and balances over time is going to be corrupted, and that he became less accountable, more tyrannical, more threatened, didn't want to have his premises subjected to any court orders or court tests or evidence. He wanted to be a spy and a monarch." And she said, "That's our fault. We left him there." And that, to me, is the extraordinary sense of citizenship that you have coming out of the civil rights movement, where you have these people who aren't allowed to vote themselves say the first premise of saving American democracy is to act like we own an equal share in this government, whether we do or not.
By our fault, she means American citizenry.
The American citizenry.
Not the movement, but America.
No, not the movement.
Right.
She means, and of course, that's what she's saying. The first duty of people, the way the movement is born, is people ask questions about what is my duty as a citizen. Selma, she planned Selma on the night of the Birmingham church bombing and had the plan by morning, and busted into Dr. King, drove to Birmingham and broke into the funeral arrangements and the demonstration in the street and said, "Here, Dr. King, you need to do this. Well, if black people could vote in Alabama, you wouldn't have these crimes." And she pestered him until he went to Selma.
Right. This week, just 4 days ago, if I'm not mistaken, Mrs. King passed away, Coretta Scott King, an Alabamian. I'm interested in, of course, you did not write her biography, but she figures. She's always absolutely there. How shall we think about her as a helpmeet, power behind the throne, counselor? What was her part in the movement with him?
She had two distinct roles, I think. One that's fairly well known, that Dr. King valued her immense dignity, which in the time of segregation played an important psychological role for people whose dignities were being assaulted every day. It's hard to remember that on their wedding night they couldn't stay in a hotel in Alabama, and they had to sleep in the back of a funeral parlor among caskets, and her dignity helped protect that as kind of a first lady. That became problematical later if some of her children get kind of lost in that dignity as its own reward. Her other big contribution is less well known, is that she had a fully breathed understanding of nonviolence and was in fact a pioneer in applying nonviolence outside the race issue to issues of war and peace. Dr. King was not only comfortable with that, that's the basis of his Nobel Prize speech, that he thought nonviolence would apply to the triple scourges of war, poverty, and racism. But he actually asked her to make speeches on the issue of war and peace, on the broader applications of nonviolence. He got in all kind of trouble with that when he criticized the Vietnam War from a coherent philosophy, and people basically said, you should stick to race relations, right. Stay out of this. Even people in the civil rights movement condemned him, but Coretta maintained a steady witness on that, and in that sense, I think, and her insistence later, after he was killed, to call the King Center the Nonviolence Center, the Center for Nonviolence, she really understood the breadth of his philosophy and made her own contributions in that respect.
Yeah. On the radio this week, Maya Angelou suggested that you said that Dr. King was planning to divorce his wife, that he had other women he was interested in, and that he was planning to divorce her. And since it was nationally broadcast, I thought I'd give you a chance to respond to that.
Well, Maya's a great poet, but I didn't say that in the book, and to me it's not there. So that's basically all I can say. It's not in there at all. It is kind of a paradox to me that people who complain about humanizing Dr. King or dealing with the blackmail in his life as a historical event, that we shouldn't dwell on that. That's her only response so far is to talk about a personal thing that's not even there. So I don't really know what to make of it, but I know that she values the positive aspects of the movement, not just as an example for Dr. King or for black people. What I think grows out of this thing is that Dr. King specifically and the movement as a whole were leaders for all of America at this time. White, because they were essentially doing just what the founding fathers did. They were confronting systems of hierarchy and oppression, and they were figuring out political ways, not violent ways, but political ways to build fellow citizenship, that, create systems of fellow citizenship. And they did. And as Dr. King said, they liberated not only black people from terror and segregation, but white people. Dr. King said, this will liberate the white South. And he was right. It created the Sun Belt South and the two-party South, where Southern politicians can aspire to national office. They're no longer stigmatized. It even made the South safe for professional sports. But people forget that. We never had the Atlanta Braves or the Miami Dolphins when it was segregated. And when the movement liberated the South from that, prosperity, freedom, free thought, and all that sort of stuff leaps in. And when people started struggling with what equal citizenship really meant, it liberated not only blacks and whites, but all women. One of my biggest surprises in here was to discover that women in Alabama of all races were ineligible to serve on juries under state law, any jury, a criminal jury, a civil jury, a grand jury. They were banned because the idea of women was that they shouldn't hear nasty language and that this was men's business, and they were banned until the civil rights movement started struggling over, well, is that compatible with our notions of equal citizenship? So every woman who serves on a jury or wants her daughter to serve on a jury, and every father owes a debt to this movement because it freed people in ways that we take for granted.
In ways that people don't really understand.
No.
Feminism is born in the civil rights movement.
Right, and it's a natural birth, because when you're really thinking about, why do we treat people this way, and why do we presume that some jobs are for one and not another, and when you question it about black people and white people, it leads naturally to people in the movement and out of the movement saying, well, we have these similar systems everywhere else in the way we treat people by gender, and do those make sense?
Here we are in 2006. If Dr. King were alive and he could look around in terms of American society, race, economics, poverty, gender, war, in a sense, I know you could write another book, but in a sense, what kind of marks would he give us in these different categories?
I think, first of all, he'd be amazed by a lot of things that that we take for granted. He'd be amazed to see black people on television delivering the news and being Secretary of State, and even playing sports on TV. We have to remember that in 1968, when he was killed, if he had turned on the TV to watch a basketball game on Saturday, it would have been a college game. It would be all white people. So he'd be amazed by a lot of things that have happened. He'd be saddened by the poverty. I think that he'd be saddened by the war in Iraq, because to Dr. King, fostering democracy, and democracy is nonviolence. Every vote is a piece of nonviolence, and in Vietnam and otherwise, he's saying that arms are not the way to promote democracy, certainly not without more informed debate than we have now. We just kind of presume that if we blow up a place and send in the Marines, democracy will flower.
Well, that's a wonderfully optimistic ending, and one often hears that we're slipping back or that not enough progress has been made. But you're clearly upbeat about this.
I am. I think I'm upbeat about our conditions. I'm sad that our language in politics is not more fundamentally engaged with democracy and offering more hope. To me, the amazing thing is that the movement was optimistic at a time when there was much less reason for hope. We still had lynchings going on. We're still in the grip of segregation. And they found reason to really grapple with democracy and offer hope then. We ought to be doing it in a more engaged way as citizens today.
Thank you. I feel better.
Thank you.
No, this has really been a lot of fun. I've looked forward to it. I wish we could talk for hours. I'm sure that we could.
Thank you very much. Our best wishes to everybody in Alabama. This history provided a great blessing for the whole country.